Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. Larry Correia has just finished his 6-volume fantasy series. Technically, the final book is not out until the 4th, I believe, but the advanced reader copies have been out for a little bit, and I've been seeing some interesting chatter about them. You see, Correia dedicates the book to George R.R. Martin, telling him, see, it's not that hard. I've included a screenshot of this courtesy of the Twitter account Alexander Stoyanov, who has clearly gotten his hands on one of those advanced copies. Now, this ignited the usual discussion about quote-unquote epic fantasy. If you're not a super insular fantasy nerd, you may not be familiar with this discussion, but it boils down to a certain amount of reticence among hardcore readers to invest too heavily in a new long-running fantasy series, what publishers tend to refer to as an epic series for marketing purposes. Between George R.R. Martin likely never finishing his Song of Ice and Fire series, and a decade or so previously, Robert Jordan dying before he could complete his Wheel of Time series, one can hardly blame them per se. There is certainly a risk involved in investing yourself in any long-running media property. Now, both Jordan and Martin got their series finished by other creators. Martin in the often maligned 8th season of Game of Thrones, and Robert Jordan through the fantasy author Brandon Sanderson, who picked up all of his extensive notes and completed the series at the behest of the estate. People are generally a little more positive about that continuation, but it's a book series, not a TV series, so there's a lot fewer people who know of it, period. So there seems to be less of a consensus opinion, but everyone I know personally who has read the series is fine with the continuation that Sanderson wrote. I myself was never really a fan of either one of these series, so I'm just going to play Switzerland and remain neutral on this topic. The point is, these two big case studies, combined with a couple of other authors who I'm even less familiar with, who have started long-running series and failed to finish them, have left the general reading public touchy about picking up a big series, at least until it's finished. This is a topic Correia himself has commented on. He doesn't think it's fair that one author should be judged by the work of another author, because there's really no reason to think that the writing habits of one author that leave them incapable of finishing a series will be duplicated by another author who is perfectly capable of finishing one or even more series. He is, of course, eminently correct there. Authors are very different people with very different work ethics, and in an ideal world, they would be judged individually, but that's not the way the real world works. So Correia has set out to use his own series as an example of how epic fantasy series are still getting finished. There are still authors out there who are doing the work, thinking ahead, and have the skill and craft necessary to see their vision all the way through to reality, no matter how big that vision is. However, there are other creators in the medium, especially the so-called pulp revolution, people I have discussed in the past. Authors who believe that shorter, more concise storytelling is really what we need in fiction today. We need to focus on telling sharp, hard-hitting stories as concisely as possible, rather than printing door stoppers every 6 months or so. This was the debate that was reignited when Correia took a little jab at George Martin. And you know what? I think both sides are a little bit right and a little bit wrong. But I'm not going to try and meet them in the middle, because that's not actually what I'm interested in. Both sides of this debate are interested in the length of stories. Correia feels that independent authors who don't have a finished series ready to go to satisfy the public are at a disadvantage in the market right now. The basic argument for that goes like this. Purchasing editors are very in touch with the most enfranchised members of the reading community, and the most enfranchised members of the fantasy community are currently very skittish about quote-unquote epic fantasy. There are a lot of readers out there who are not particularly familiar with the failed project of a handful of fantasy authors. I'm sure most fans of the show Game of Thrones assume that the series was finished because they got a complete story out of the TV show and it was based on the novels. The broader public tends not to look very deeply into the source material for the adaptations they watch. So casual readers, maybe they don't care as much about incomplete projects, But the really enfranchised people, the people who purchasing editors tend to get a lot of feedback from, the kind of people who show up at conventions and talk to people at booths, these are the people who are going to be very concerned about the question of whether the fantasy project that they invest so much time and money into is ever going to finish. And so these purchasing editors are going to look at prospective manuscripts that new authors are pitching them, authors with no publishing history to really base it on, and authors who are pitching very long-running stories. Those purchasing editors are going to say, are you going to finish this? Bring me the final manuscript for the whole thing, and then we'll talk. That is a colossal hurdle to overcome for new writers. That is the kind of hurdle that Correia is trying to lower for new writers coming into the industry. And I think that is very, very laudable of him. He's trying to make the way easier for the people who follow after him. And that, in my opinion, is the kind of chivalrous behavior that every real man should engage in whatever their craft is. I respect Larry for it an incredible amount. Now, the pulp folks are saying, if the audience for your craft doesn't want you to make exactly what you want to make, maybe you should practice making a little bit of what they want to see, and you can lure them in that way, or maybe you'll find you like this other kind of craftsmanship. And I have a certain amount of respect for that position as well. Storytelling is reliant on both the audience and the storyteller. Really, a story exists at the place where these two things meet. It's all fine and dandy to have your artistic vision, but you will never know if you've really accomplished it until you have the audience look at it and respond to it. If you can't get an audience at all, that is something of an indictment on you, the author. And yes, purchasing editors are part of your audience. At least if you're going the trad pub route. We're not going to debate trad pub versus indie pub in this video. With all that said, I feel like the pulp folks, while they make a decent point, are a little bit biased in this. They are a group of people who are really dissatisfied with the current state of storytelling, and they want their own style of storytelling to undergo a renaissance. That's all well and good. I've mentioned before that I don't know as the current market is really situated for that kind of a renaissance. But it is an open question as to whether the market is well situated for epic fantasy to undergo a resurgence as well. Cozy fantasy is the current hotness, and I'm sure that will not stay any longer than any other form of fantasy has in the past or the present. If you want a really good breakdown of how generic fantasy is a moving target, Grim Jim has a pretty good video discussing that topic. However, I'm not saying you should shoot for cozy fantasy any more than you should shoot for pulp fantasy. The issue at hand is epic fantasy, and I think the issue is the first word, the epic part. See, in this debate between epic and pulp, the entire discussion is wrapped up in the length of the story. And you want to know what? I honestly don't care about the length of the story unless it's really bad. If a story is good or even great, the length doesn't matter as much to me. And that's the really interesting thing about this debate. I haven't read Larry Correia's fantasy series, but I have read the Grim Noir Chronicles and Monster Hunter International. I'm still waiting for a sequel to Bloodlines, by the way. I know Correia is a really entertaining author, and so long as I see something that I'm really interested in from him, I'm happy to pick up a book and give it a look. Now, I didn't vibe very much with Son of the Black Sword or the other books in Larry's fantasy series, but that's no knock on him. That's just a matter of personal taste. It also wasn't a question of length. I still don't know how long Monster Hunter International is going to run for. I'm very happy, though, every time I see a new book in the series. I pick it up and I read it because I know they're probably going to be entertaining. It is Larry that sells books to me, not Epic. But of course, this is a question about new authors. How do new authors break in? Well, the answer is not through epic fantasy. That doesn't mean you can't write an epic story, however. These marketing terms and genre descriptions are a mishmash of qualities, and just because you don't mention a quality in promoting your work doesn't mean that quality isn't there. Do you want to write an epic fantasy book? and sell it to a market that is kind of leery of epic fantasy? Just don't call it epic. Again, the debate is about the length. And if you just replace the length of the book with some other quality of the book that people are going to like in the current atmosphere, I think you'll do just fine. In the era of cozy fantasy, maybe you want to talk about your characters. Those kind of stories tend to be very character-driven. At least the good ones. The bad ones don't have any drive at all. But that's neither here nor there. Romantasy is very popular, and fantasy epics often have an element of romance to them. A great love thwarted by fate or war or tragedy is a classic part of these kinds of stories. Play up the star-crossed lovers aspect, and maybe you can slip in the War of the Roses plus dragons and win over your audience. Ultimately, I think this is the hazard of slipping into a genre writer mindset. You tend to become fixated on those aspects of writing that make up your genre or your medium. As a result, your options and your creativity to promote yourself become very limited because you're only thinking about one part of your work rather than the totality of your work and what might entice people to give it a try. Epic fantasy, heroic fantasy, punchy action-packed fantasy. These things can all be the same story. These are all ways you can promote your story, and if one of them isn't working to the current audience, don't be worried about it. Pick up your next option and give it a spin. Now, if you want to pick up a little bit of fiction to give it a spin yourself, I have a collection called Have Spell Will Travel available from Amazon.com. The link is down in the description below. You can give that a look and support the channel that way. It's the only way I ask my viewers to consider supporting me, and I really appreciate it. Let me know what you think of the question of epic fantasy and whether we should really be using length as a selling point for stories in the first place. While you're down there, there's a like button and a subscribe button. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.